remember the stillness first, not the kind that feels peaceful, but the kind that feels as though something is waiting. The window was slightly open, just enough for the curtain to move, but that evening, it barely did. Even the air felt like it had paused. I was sitting beside the lamp, the same one I still keep near me, now its light soft and golden, touching only half the room. The other half stayed in shadow. I liked it that way back then. It made everything feel quieter, smaller, easier to hold. But that evening, something didn't sit right. I couldn't name it. I tried to ignore it. I remember adjusting the edge of my dress, smoothing it over my knees for no reason at all, just to keep my hands busy. Outside, the road was nearly empty. A bicycle passed, once the sound of its wheels slow, almost hesitant, then nothing again. It was strange, because evenings like that used to feel full of small expectations. Footsteps, voices of familiar rhythm I had come to recognize without thinking. I still remember how I used to sit there pretending not to wait, but always listening, always noticing. He used to pass by around that time, not always stopping, but always just enough. A glance, a small nod, sometimes a few words, and somehow that had become part of my evenings. So quietly, I never even realized when it began to matter. But that evening, there was nothing. I told myself it didn't mean anything. People get busy days, change routines, slip away. Still, I kept listening, just in case. The clock ticked a little louder than usual. Or maybe I was just paying attention now. Each second felt separate, like it didn't want to move forward. I remember thinking, should I close the window? But I didn't. I left it open, as if closing it might mean accepting something I wasn't ready to understand. There was a moment, a very small one, when I thought I heard footsteps. Soft, uneven, like someone slowing down. My heart noticed before I did, but they passed, without stopping, without even pausing, and I didn't move. I just sat there, hands still, eyes resting somewhere between the light and the dark. It's strange how you can feel something changing before you know what it is. Back then, I didn't have the words for it. I only had the feeling, a quiet, uncertain feeling that something familiar was beginning to move away from me. And I remember asking myself very softly, did I do something wrong? Or did something change without me? I didn't have an answer. Not that evening. If you've ever held onto a small memory like this, you can stay here with me and listen a little longer, because that quiet evening was only the beginning. And at the time, I still believed it would pass. I truly did. But the next day, something small happened, something I almost ignored. And yet, I still remember it. Part 2, when he first began to change ambience. Light footsteps on gravel, plus distant bicycle bell, plus soft evening breeze. It wasn't sudden, that's what made it harder to understand. If something breaks all at once, you notice. You react. You ask questions. But this was different. It began with something so small, I almost convinced myself It didn't happen at all. The next afternoon, I saw him across the road. The same place he always passed. The same hour. The same quiet stretch between two houses where the sunlight fell just right. I remember the way the light touched his shoulder, the way it always had. Nothing looked different. Not at first. I slowed my steps just slightly. Not enough for anyone else to notice. Just enough to give that moment time to unfold. He saw me. I'm certain of it. There's a way people look at you, even from a distance, a kind of recognition that doesn't need words. And for a second, that recognition was there. But then it slipped. Not completely. Not in a way I could point to and say, there, that changed. Just enough to feel unfamiliar. He adjusted his path, very slightly, as if something had caught his attention somewhere else. His steps didn't stop. They didn't slow. And he didn't wave. It was such a small thing, so easy to explain. Maybe he was distracted. Maybe he didn't see clearly. Maybe. I gave myself many reasons, gentle ones, comforting ones, and I accepted them. At least I tried to, but something inside me held onto that moment. Quietly. I still remember standing there watching him pass, feeling as though I had missed something invisible. Not lost it. Not yet. Just missed it. That evening I returned to the window again. Earlier this time, without telling myself why, the air moved a little more than before. The curtain shifted, softly brushing the edge of the wooden frame. I waited, not intentionally, just present. The bicycle passed again. Different rider, same slow rhythm, and then footsteps. This time they slowed, just slightly. My hands stilled, without me asking them to. I didn't turn right away. I don't know why. Maybe I didn't want to seem like I was waiting. Or maybe I was afraid the moment would disappear if I moved too quickly. When I finally looked, he was there, closer than I expected, standing just beyond the gate. For a brief second, everything felt normal again, familiar. He gave a small nod, the same one, the same quiet acknowledgement. But something was missing. It wasn't in what he did. It was in how quickly it ended. Usually there was a pause, a few words, even silence shared but not empty. This time he shifted his weight as if he had already decided to leave. Evening, he said. His voice was the same, but it didn't stay. I replied, I think I did. I don't remember what I said. Only that it felt shorter than usual. And then he stepped back. Not abruptly. Not rudely. Just earlier than expected. I should go, he said. There was no reason given. No explanation. And somehow that made it harder to question. I nodded, as if I understood. Even though I didn't, he walked away. Not fast, not slow, just steady. And I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, listening to the sound of his steps fade until they became part of everything else. That night, I told myself again it was nothing. People have things on their minds. Days change. Feelings shift. I repeated it gently, like something you say not because you believe it, but because you need to. Still, a small question remained. Quiet, unfinished. Why did he seem like he was already somewhere else, even when he was standing right in front of me? I didn't ask him. Not then. And the next time I saw him, the distance felt just a little wider. So small, you could almost ignore it. Almost. But I didn't know yet how much those small spaces would grow, or how quietly something can begin to disappear before you even think to hold on to it. And a few days later, there was something else, something even harder to explain. But I remember it clearly, because that was the moment I stopped trusting what I thought I understood. It's strange how the smallest changes are the ones that stay with you the longest. Not because they are loud, but because they don't quite make sense. A few days after that evening, I found myself walking a little earlier than usual. Not consciously, not with a plan, just earlier. The path was the same. A narrow stretch of road lined with low fences and trees that leaned just slightly inward as if listening. I used to like that feeling, as though the world was quietly aware of us. That day, it felt different. I reached the corner where we sometimes crossed paths. Not intentionally, just often enough for it to become familiar. And I slowed. No reason, just a feeling. The kind that doesn't explain itself. I waited there for a moment. Then another. No footsteps. No bicycle. Nothing. I remember looking down at the ground, tracing the shape of a small crack in the dirt with the tip of my shoe. It was something to do. Something to make the waiting feel unintentional. After a while, I told myself I should keep walking. So I did. But as I moved forward, there was a quiet thought lingering just behind everything else. Had I missed him, or had he not come at all? That question stayed with me longer than it should have. Because the next day, something similar happened again. Same path, same hour, but this time I saw him, far ahead, near the bend where the road curved out of sight. He was there, standing still, not alone. There was someone beside him. At first, I couldn't see clearly, just the outline, a shape, a presence. I slowed. Not enough to draw attention, just enough to understand what I was seeing. They weren't speaking loudly. In fact, I couldn't hear anything at all. But there was something in the way they stood. Closer than strangers, more familiar than casual. And something inside me noticed that. Before I allowed myself to think it, I remember telling myself it could be anyone, a relative, a neighbor, someone passing by. There are many ways to explain a moment when you don't want to accept it. I kept walking, steady, calm, as if nothing had changed. But just before I reached the bend, he moved. Not toward me, away. The movement was subtle, almost polite, as if creating space, but not for me, for her. That was the first time a quiet thought appeared without permission. Why didn't he stay? I didn't stop. I didn't look directly. I passed by, as though I hadn't seen anything at all. And maybe in that moment, I truly believed I hadn't, because what I saw didn't fit with what I understood. That evening, I didn't sit by the window right away. I stayed inside longer than usual, helping with small things that didn't need helping, folding, arranging, adjusting, anything to delay that familiar waiting. But eventually, I went back. The lamp was already lit, its glow steady, unchanged, as if nothing in the world had shifted. I sat down slowly, carefully, listening, but not expecting. And for the first time, I asked myself something I hadn't before: was I the only one still holding onto something that had already begun to change? The question didn't feel sharp. It felt quiet, almost gentle. And that's what made it harder to answer, because a part of me still wanted to believe nothing had truly changed. But another part, the quieter one, was beginning to notice patterns. Small absences, slight distances, moments that no longer aligned. And I didn't know which part to trust. So I did what felt easiest. I said nothing. I waited, and I told myself if something was wrong, I would understand it soon. But understanding doesn't always arrive the way you expect. Sometimes it waits until you see something you cannot unsee. And when that moment came, it didn't feel loud. It felt very quiet. I hadn't meant to go out that evening, not really. The day had already begun to settle, the light softer, lower, stretching longer across the ground. It was the kind of evening that usually asked for stillness, for staying in, for letting time pass quietly. And yet, something in me felt unsettled, not restless in a loud way, not urgent, just unfinished. I tried to ignore it. I really did. I stayed inside longer than usual, moved slowly from one small task to another, folding things that were already folded, adjusting things that didn't need adjusting. But the feeling remained, soft, persistent, like a thought that hadn't fully formed. Eventually, without deciding to, I found myself near the door, my hand resting lightly against the handle. I remember pausing there just for a moment, as if something inside me was asking, "Do you really want to go?" And I didn't answer. I just opened it. The air outside felt different that evening. Cooler, quieter. The kind of quiet that doesn't feel empty, but full of something you can't quite name. I stepped out slowly, let the door close behind me without sound. For a second, I stood still, listening. There were distant voices somewhere far off, but they didn't reach me clearly, just enough to remind me the world was still moving. I began to walk, not toward any place in particular. At least that's what I told myself. But our feet, they often know more than we admit. The path felt familiar, too familiar to be accidental. Each step fell into a rhythm I didn't have to think about. Past the same fence, the same narrow turn, the same uneven patch of ground that always made me slow down slightly. I noticed everything, more than usual. The texture of the road, beneath my shoes, the way the light faded unevenly across the walls, the quiet hum of evening settling in. It all felt sharper, as if I was paying attention because something in me expected to understand something. Halfway there I slowed, not because I was tired, because a thought had arrived, a quiet one. What if nothing is there? I let that thought sit with me. What if I reach the end of this walk and everything is just as it should be? Normal, unchanged. I almost turned back then. Almost. It would have been easy to return home, to sit by the lamp again, to let the questions fade on their own. But something held me there. Not curiosity alone, something deeper. The need to know even if knowing changed something. So I kept walking. Slower now, more aware. The bend in the road appeared ahead. The same one I had passed so many times before. Nothing about it looked different. And yet that evening, it felt like a threshold, as though crossing it would quietly divide something into before and after. I felt it, not clearly, not fully, but enough to hesitate. My steps grew softer, careful, as if I didn't want to disturb whatever was waiting ahead. And then, just before I reached it, I heard something. A faint sound, not loud, not sudden, just laughter, soft, close, and unfamiliar. My breath slowed, not from fear, from recognition that this moment was not going to pass unnoticed. I moved forward, just slightly, enough to see, and what I saw, I didn't understand right away. Because sometimes the truth doesn't arrive all at once. It begins as something you almost recognize, but aren't ready to accept. And I stood there at the edge of that quiet evening, not yet knowing that this was the moment. Everything I had been quietly questioning would begin to make sense. In the gentlest and most irreversible way. Part 5. The moment I saw them. Ambience. Sudden stillness plus faint evening wind plus distant soft laughter fading into silence. The laughter came again, softer this time, as if it belonged to a moment I wasn't meant to hear. I didn't step forward right away. I stayed where I was just before the bend, where the road still held me in shadow. There is a kind of hesitation that doesn't feel like fear. It feels like knowing that once you move, something will become real. And real things do not return to what they were. Still, I moved. Only a little. Just enough for the scene to open quietly in front of me. They were standing near the old fence, the one with uneven wood slightly leaning, as if time had grown tired of holding it straight. I knew that place. I knew it well. And for a moment, that familiarity confused me. Because what I saw there did not belong to what I remembered. He was standing with her, not close enough to seem obvious, not distant enough to seem casual. Somewhere in between. That quiet space where something exists, but isn't spoken. She was facing him, slightly turned, and he was looking at her the way I paused. Because there are some thoughts you don't complete right away. You let them linger, as if finishing them would make them harder to carry. The wind moved gently through the trees, just enough to shift the edge of her hair. he said something. I couldn't hear it, but I saw the way she smiled. Not surprised, not unsure, familiar. That was the part that stayed with me, familiar. As if this moment had happened before, more than once. I felt something then, not sharp, not overwhelming, just a quiet shift, like a small piece inside me moving slightly out of place. I remember thinking, maybe I misunderstood. Maybe this is nothing. People talk, people meet. There are many ways to explain what you see when you're not ready to understand it. But then he stepped a little closer. Not much, just enough that the space between them changed. And something inside me recognized that change. Without asking permission, I didn't move. I didn't speak. I didn't even breathe the way I normally would. I just stood there holding the moment as gently as I could, as if any sudden movement might break something I wasn't prepared to lose. Did they see me? I've asked myself that question many times. Even now, I don't think they did. Or maybe they chose not to. Sometimes, it's hard to tell the difference. The evening stayed quiet. Too quiet. As if the world had stepped back to let this moment exist on its own. I watched for a little longer than I should have. Not long enough to understand everything, but long enough to stop pretending. And that was the moment. Not when I saw them, but when I understood that what I had been feeling all those days had not been imagined. It had simply been unseen. Until now, I stepped back slowly, carefully, the way you leave a place when you realize you were never meant to arrive there. My footsteps made no sound, or maybe I just don't remember them, because everything inside me had grown very still, not empty, just quiet. There were no questions then, no sudden thoughts, only a soft, unfolding understanding, and a single realization that settled gently without resistance. He had not been moving away without reason. He had simply been moving toward something else, and I had been the only one standing still. I didn't cry, not then. That surprised me, because I had always thought that moments like this would feel louder, but this one didn't. It felt like silence, deep, uninterrupted silence. And as I walked away, there was one thought that stayed with me. Soft, unfinished. How long had it been this way before I ever noticed? That was the question I carried home with me. And somehow, it stayed longer than anything else. Because what hurt the most was not what I saw, but what I began to understand after. I thought for a long time that the moment itself would be the hardest part. Seeing them, standing there together. But it was. That part was quiet. What stayed with me, what followed me home, was something else, something slower. Something that didn't arrive all at once, but unfolded, piece by piece. I walked without noticing the path. The same road, the same turns, the same small sounds beneath my feet, but none of it felt familiar anymore. As if the world had shifted slightly just enough that everything I knew sat at a different angle. I remember passing the fence again, the one I had just seen them beside. I didn't look, not because I was afraid, but because I already knew. And knowing once is enough. The air felt cooler now, or maybe it was just me. My hands had grown still, not tense, not trembling, just still, as if they, too, were trying to understand something. And then the thoughts began, not loud, not rushed, quiet, measured, one at a time. How long had he been distant? I tried to trace it back, to find the beginning, but it didn't have one clear point. Just small moments scattered across days. The missed glance, the shortened conversations, the way he stood slightly turned away. Each one so easy to overlook, so easy to forgive. I had explained them all, gently, kindly, as if protecting something fragile. And maybe I was, but now those moments returned, not as questions, as answers. That was the part that hurt, not the seeing, the understanding. Because understanding doesn't ask permission. It arrives and quietly rearranges everything. I remember stopping for a moment, not because I needed to, but because something inside me paused. I looked down at my hands. They looked the same. Nothing had changed. And yet everything felt different. I asked myself something then, very softly. Was there a moment when I could have known sooner? The question didn't feel accusing. It felt gentle, almost like a whisper from somewhere deep inside. And I didn't answer it, because I think a part of me already knew. I had seen the changes. I had felt them, but I had chosen to wait, to believe, to let things remain unclear a little longer. There is a quiet comfort in not knowing, because as long as something is uncertain, it can still become something else. But once you understand, it settles, and it does not move again. I reached home without realizing how. The door felt the same beneath my hand. The room looked unchanged. The lamp was already lit, its glow steady, warm, unaware. I sat beside it, just as I had so many evenings before, and for a moment everything looked exactly the same. But I was. That was the difference. I leaned back slightly, letting the light rest across my hands. And I remember thinking, not with sadness, not even with anger, just with a quiet kind of clarity. He hadn't taken anything from me. He had simply given something to someone else. And somehow that made it harder to hold on to. The room felt quieter than usual. Not empty, just still. And in that stillness, another thought came. One I didn't expect. Why didn't I ask him? Why didn't I say anything when I still could have? The question stayed, unanswered. Because even then, I think I knew. I wasn't going to ask. And that choice, that quiet, simple choice, would stay with me long after everything else had faded. Because sometimes what remains is not what happened, but what we never said about it. And that night, I said nothing. Not to him, not to anyone, not even to myself, in a way that could be spoken aloud. I just sat there beside the lamp, holding a truth that had finally become clear, and a silence I had already chosen to keep. But silence has a way of growing. And the next morning, it felt different again, quieter in a way I hadn't expected. Morning came the way it always does, softly, without asking anything of you. The light entered the room the same way, resting gently along the wall, touching the edge of the table, finding its place without hesitation. For a moment, I almost believed nothing had changed, that the evening before had simply passed like any other. But then, that quiet understanding returned. Not suddenly, just present, like something waiting patiently for me to notice it again. I moved through the morning slowly. The same routine, the same small tasks, but everything felt slightly distant, as if I was watching myself from just a step away. I remember pausing near the window, looking outside without really seeing anything. And that's when the questions began. Not all at once, one at a time, careful, measured. What would I say if I saw him today? The thought stayed. I let it settle without answering. Another followed. Would I ask him about her? I felt something shift inside me. Not discomfort, something quieter. Recognition. Because I already knew the answer. No, I wouldn't ask. And once that became clear, other questions started to fade. Not because they didn't matter, but because they no longer had a place to go. I imagined the conversation just for a moment, not fully, just pieces. His voice, my voice, words forming between us, trying to explain something that had already explained itself. And in that imagined moment, I felt something unexpected. Not relief, not closure, just unnecessary. Because what I had seen didn't need confirmation. It didn't need explanation. It had already said everything, without a single word. I stepped away from the window. The room felt smaller now, not in size, in feeling, as if something had quietly been removed and the space it left behind had not yet been filled. I sat down again. The chair felt the same, the wood beneath my fingers familiar, and still something within me remained unsettled, not broken, just unanswered. I asked myself one more thing, very softly. Did he ever mean it the way I did? That question stayed longer than the others, because it reached further back, into moments I had once trusted, into words I had believed, into silences that had once felt shared. And for the first time, I allowed myself to consider maybe we had not been holding the same thing, even when it felt like we were. That thought didn't hurt, not in the way I expected. It simply settled like everything else had, and with it came a quiet decision, not made out of pride, not out of fear, just clarity. I would say nothing, not because I didn't have questions, but because I no longer needed answers. There is a kind of silence that feels empty, and another that feels complete. That morning mine felt complete, not peaceful, but certain. And certainty has a stillness of its own. I went through the rest of the day quietly. If I saw him, I don't remember. Or maybe I chose not to remember, because some moments do not need to repeat. They have already done their part. And by evening, I returned to the same place, the same room, the same lamp, the same soft glow resting against the walls. Everything looked unchanged, but I carried something different now. Not confusion, not even sadness, just a silence I had chosen, and a question I would never ask. Sometimes what we leave unspoken becomes the most permanent part of a memory. And that evening, I understood that for the first time. Not fully, but enough. Enough to let the moment stay exactly as it was, unfinished, and quietly accepted. Because what came after was not about what happened, but about how I chose to carry it. That night felt almost identical to the one before. The same lamp, the same chair, the same quiet room holding its breath in gentle stillness. If someone had walked in, they wouldn't have noticed anything different. And yet, everything had changed. I sat down slowly, carefully, as if the air itself had become something I could disturb. The light from the lamp rested softly across my hands again. Warm, steady, unquestioning. I remember placing my fingers against the edge of the table, tracing a small, familiar line in the wood. I had done that many times before, without thinking. But this time, I noticed it. Every small movement felt deliberate, as if I was learning how to exist in the same space, but with something missing. I thought about speaking, not to him, to someone, anyone. A simple sentence, a passing mention, something like, "I saw him yesterday." But even that felt like too much, not because the words were heavy, but because they would make the moment real in a different way, shared. And somehow I wasn't ready for that, so I kept it, all of it, quietly. There is a strange comfort in holding something entirely on your own. It doesn't change. It doesn't get questioned. It simply stays exactly as you remember it. I leaned back, slightly letting the chair hold my weight. The room felt softer now. Not because anything had improved, but because I had stopped resisting what I understood. And that made everything feel lighter. Not happy, just lighter. I listened to the sounds around me. The faint movement of the curtain, the distant wind brushing against the outside walls, the quiet rhythm of the clock continuing without pause. Time had not changed. It never does. Only we do. I wondered, briefly, what he was doing at that same moment. Not with curiosity, not with longing, just a passing thought. And for the first time, that thought didn't stay. It came, and then it left, gently, without asking to remain. That surprised me, because I had expected the memory to hold tighter, to linger. But instead it began to settle, not disappear, just find its place. I closed my eyes for a moment, not to escape the thought, but to feel it fully. The image returned. The fence, the evening light, the quiet space between them, and me, standing just far enough away to see everything and say nothing. I opened my eyes again. The room was the same, the lamp still glowing softly, and I realized something then. very quietly. That moment would never change. It would remain exactly as it was, unspoken, unquestioned, complete in its silence, and I would carry it that way, not because I had to, but because I chose to. That choice felt important, not heavy, just certain. I shifted slightly in my seat. The wood beneath me creaked softly, a small sound, but it felt louder in the stillness. And then, almost without realizing, I let out a slow breath. One I hadn't noticed I was holding. It left me gently, taking something with it. Not the memory. That remained, but the need to change it, to question it, to understand more than what had already been given. And in that quiet release, the room felt even softer, more still, as if everything had settled into its place. I didn't move much after that. I just sat there, letting the night pass, letting the silence remain. Because sometimes, silence is not empty. It is simply full of things we have chosen to leave untouched. And that night, I left everything exactly where it was, undisturbed. Even now, when I think back to that evening, I don't remember what I lost. I remember what I kept. A quiet moment, a quiet understanding, and a silence that never asked to be broken. Because what followed was not about speaking. It was about living with something that would never be said. Part 9. The life that continued anyway. Ambience. Soft morning birds, plus distant village sounds, fading into evening calm, plus gentle passage of time tone. The next days arrived quietly, one after another, without asking how I felt about them. That is the way time moves. It does not pause even when something inside you has. I returned to my routines, the same paths, the same hours, the same familiar places that had once felt full of small meaning. Now they felt different, not empty, just lighter, as though something invisible had been lifted and taken elsewhere. I still passed the bend in the road, the same one. I didn't avoid it, but I didn't slow down anymore. There was nothing left there that I needed to understand. Sometimes I wondered if I would see them again. That thought came and went, softly, like everything else. And then one afternoon I did. Not the same way, not the same place, just a glimpse from a distance. They were walking together, not close enough to draw attention, not far enough to seem separate. That same quiet space between them, I recognized it immediately. The way you recognize something not because you want to, but because you've already seen it once before. I didn't stop. I didn't turn. I let the moment pass as gently as it had arrived. And for the first time, it didn't stay with me. That surprised me, because I had thought it would feel the same. But it didn't. It felt distant, not in space, in meaning, as though it no longer belonged to me, and maybe it never truly had. That thought came quietly, without resistance, and settled just as softly. The days continued. The evenings returned, and I still sat by the lamp, out of habit, out of comfort, or maybe because some things don't need to change even when everything else has. The light remained the same, warm, steady, faithful in a way people sometimes are not. I would sit their hands resting gently in my lap, listening to the familiar sounds of night. And sometimes, without intending to, I would remember that evening. Not the whole of it, just pieces. The stillness, the laughter, the quiet understanding that followed. They would come and go like passing thoughts, never forcing themselves to stay. And I let them. I never tried to hold them longer or push them away, because by then they no longer asked anything of me. That is how memories change over time, not in what they are, but in how they sit within you. At first, they feel close, sharp, unsettled, but slowly, without you noticing, they soften. They find their place, and they remain there, quiet. I think that was the moment I understood something important. Not about him, not even about what had happened, but about myself, that I could carry something unfinished and still move forward, not because it no longer mattered, but because it no longer needed to change. And that realization felt like a kind of peace, not complete, but enough. Years passed, more moments came, different faces, different paths. Life has a way of filling itself even when something once felt empty. And yet that quiet evening in 1949 never disappeared. It stayed, not at the surface, but somewhere deeper, still, unmoved. And sometimes, even now, when the night grows very quiet, I can still feel it there. Not as pain, not as regret, just a memory that chose to remain exactly as it was. Because some moments do not ask to be changed, they only ask to be remembered. And I remember that one very clearly, even now, after everything that came after. Because what I never told anyone was not just what I saw, but what I chose to carry in silence, and how quietly life continued anyway. Until one day much later, I found myself thinking about it again, not with questions, but with something softer, something closer to understanding. It's a quiet thing looking back, not the kind of quiet that feels empty, but the kind that feels full, of things that no longer need to be spoken. I sit here, now much older, the same lamp beside me, its light softer than I remember, or maybe it is my eyes that have changed. Time does that. It softens the edges of things not by removing them, but by teaching you how to hold them differently. That evening in 1949, it never left. Not in the way some memories fade, but in the way certain moments settle quietly and stay. I can still see it if I let myself. The bend in the road, the leaning fence, the way the light rested gently across everything, as if nothing in the world was about to change. And yet, it already had. What I never told anyone was not just that I saw them. It was what I understood in that moment, and what I chose not to do with that understanding. I never asked him, not the next day, not the days after, not ever. And for a long time I wondered if that was a mistake. If perhaps There were words waiting that might have changed something, or at least given the moment a different shape. But as the years passed, that question became quieter. Not because I found an answer, but because I no longer needed one. There is a kind of peace that comes not from knowing, but from accepting what was never explained. And I learned that slowly, gently, over time. I lived my life. There were other moments, other people, other kinds of love, different in ways I couldn't have understood back then. Life did not stop. It never does. And yet that quiet evening remained not as something unfinished, but as something complete in its own silent way. Because not everything needs words to have meaning. Some things are understood once and then carried without being spoken again. I think now, if I had asked him, if I had broken that silence, the memory might have changed. It might have become something else, something louder, something that needed to be resolved. But instead, it stayed as it was, soft, still, unaltered, and in a way that made it easier to keep, not lighter, but gentler. I don't remember his voice clearly anymore, or the exact words we once shared. Those have faded, as many things do. But that feeling, that quiet shift inside me, that has remained. And perhaps that is what stays with us in the end. Not the details, but the moments that changed how we see, without asking us to speak. Sometimes I wonder if he ever thought about that evening, if he ever noticed me there, if he ever realized what I chose not to say. But the thought doesn't stay long. It comes and then it goes, like everything else, because some questions do not need answers. They simply belong to the moment they were born in. And that moment has already passed. Now, when the night grows quiet and the lamp glows softly beside me, I don't feel the same uncertainty I once did. I feel something else, something calmer, something that has learned to rest. And I think that is what I never told anyone. Not the story itself, but the silence I chose afterward. And how that silence stayed with me, not as a weight, but as a quiet companion through all the years that followed. If this memory stayed with you tonight, you can come back. I'll be here by the lamp.